The morning the estate attorney called to tell me I was inheriting $220,000, I was standing on my back porch in my bathrobe, watching a cardinal work over the seed I'd left in May's old bird feeder. I remember thinking she would have liked knowing that feeder was still getting used. I stood there for a long time after I hung up, coffee going cold in my hand. 3 hours later, I was on the floor of my kitchen with a broken hip and no way to reach the phone. My daughter and her husband arrived at the hospital that evening. They stood just inside the curtain, close enough that I could smell the restaurant they'd stopped at on the way over. My daughter leaned near my ear and whispered 4 words I have not forgotten since. "Dad, this might be it." Her husband put his hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "We should look at the paperwork this week." Then they straightened up and stayed another 12 minutes and left. What they didn't know was that I had already begun. Thank you all for your continued support of Daddy's Revenge Stories. Which city or state are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And a quick note, the story you're about to hear contains fictionalized details created for reflection and life lessons. Any resemblance to specific people or places is coincidental, but the message at the heart of it is something I believe many of you will recognize. My name is Luther Graves. I am 69 years old, and I live alone in a 3-bedroom house on Ridgecrest Drive in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I have lived there for 26 years, the last 18 months of which I have lived without May, who died on a Thursday afternoon in March from a cancer that took less than 7 months between diagnosis and the end of everything. The house still has her curtains in the front room. I haven't changed them. I don't plan to. I worked as an automotive mechanic for 34 years, most of them at the same independent shop on Rossville Boulevard that I eventually bought a partial stake in when the original owner retired. I sold my share at 62, when my knees started telling me that spending 8 hours a day on concrete was a choice, not a given. The money from the sale wasn't substantial, enough to pay off what remained on the house, enough to set aside a modest cushion, not enough to change the shape of my life in any meaningful way. My pension came to $1,340 a month, after utilities and groceries and property taxes, and the insurance on a truck I'd been driving for 9 years. I had somewhere between $300 and $400 left most months. My daughter and her husband knew this. I had told them plainly enough more than once. They had been married for 11 years. My son-in-law worked in commercial real estate, which sounds more stable than it had turned out to be. They had bought a house they couldn't quite afford in a subdivision east of town, and had been quietly running behind ever since. The $250 I wired them, most months started the year May was diagnosed. My daughter had called and said they were having a rough stretch. I said yes, that was 4 years ago. The few months became permanent, the wire transfers became routine, and by the time my older brother Willis passed away in October, the money had become so expected that neither of them mentioned it anymore. It simply appeared in their account the way the seasons appear. You stop thinking about where it comes from. Willis was 8 years older than me. He spent his career as a civil engineer for the county and lived simply his entire life in the same house outside Ottawa that he'd bought in 1979. He never married, never had kids, drove the same truck for 16 years and kept his own garden and read history books in the evening. He was 77 and he died in his sleep, and the coroner said he probably never felt it, which was, under the circumstances, the best news available. I was named sole heir. The estate, the house, the land, his savings, and a small investment account he'd built up so quietly over decades that it had grown without anyone noticing, came to just over $220,000 after legal fees. The attorney told me probate would take 3 to 5 months. Nothing was mine yet, but it was going to be. I had not told my daughter. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't secrecy for its own sake. I am not a secretive man. I grew up in a household where people said what they meant, and I had tried to carry that forward. But I had watched my daughter and her husband closely enough over the years to understand something I had resisted understanding for too long. They had developed a way of thinking about my finances as an extension of their own. The $250 a month was not generosity to them. It was a baseline, an expectation, and an inheritance of $220,000 was not, for people who thought that way, a windfall for their father. It was a problem to be managed before someone else reached it first. I had been a mechanic for 34 years. I knew the sound an engine makes when something is about to fail. That slight change in pitch, a few hundred RPM off from where it belongs, and if you've been listening long enough, you catch it before it gets worse. I had been listening to my daughter and her husband for years. I knew the pitch. Willis died October 3rd. I got the first call from the attorney October 14th. I fell off my back porch steps October 17th. The steps were wet from a morning frost. I was carrying a bag of tools out to the workshop, and I wasn't watching my feet the way I should have been. and the second step from the bottom introduced itself to my right hip without ceremony. I went down hard on the concrete pad. I knew immediately, the way you always know with that kind of pain, that something was wrong in a way that sitting still was not going to fix. I lay there for about 10 minutes before I remembered the phone in my bathrobe pocket. I called 911 myself and stayed calm on the line, which surprised me at the time. Later it didn't. Erlanger Medical Center, right hip fracture, surgery the following morning. I came out of the anesthetic around 2 in the afternoon and spent the rest of that day taking inventory of what I had. Right hip repaired with a plate and 3 screws. Left side fine, mind completely clear. And somewhere in the next few months, $220,000 coming to me from the quiet, simple life my brother had lived, if I could stay ahead of the people who were already thinking about how to reach it first. I closed my eyes and started thinking. My daughter and her husband arrived at 6 that evening. She touched my arm, said "Dad," and said the right things about pain and doctors, and being sorry she hadn't gotten there sooner. Her husband stood at the foot of the bed with his hands in his jacket pockets, and nodded along with the expression of a man running a calculation behind his eyes. They stayed close to an hour. Toward the end, my daughter stepped out to take a call in the hallway. Her husband moved to the chair beside the bed and leaned forward. "Luther," he said, dropping the dad he sometimes used, "we need to talk about the practical side of things. Flat and even, like we were discussing an estimate. When something like this happens at your age, it changes what makes sense going forward, in terms of the house, in terms of where you live." I looked at him and said nothing. "There are really good facilities around here now. Not like the old days. We've done some research, and we think." He stopped because my daughter had come back in. She gave him a look I wasn't supposed to see. He sat back. That night I lay in the dark of my hospital room and thought about the word practical. I had spent 34 years being practical. Practical meant getting to the shop at 6:30 in the morning. It meant keeping your tools organized so you didn't waste time. It meant listening to the engine until you understood exactly what was wrong before you touched it. Practical was not what my son-in-law meant when he used the word. What he meant was advantageous. He had just chosen quieter vocabulary. My physical therapist started the next morning. Her name was Wanda, and she was 51 years old with reading glasses. She kept pushing up on her nose, and a directness I respected immediately. She didn't talk to me like I was fragile. She talked to me like I was someone with a job to do. On the second day, she asked about my work, and when I told her I'd been a mechanic, she said her father had run a body shop, and she'd grown up handing him tools on weekends. After that, we understood each other without needing to say much. On day 4, I asked her to close the door. I told her what I needed. Not all of it, just enough. I needed to reach my old friend Murray without the call going through the hospital line. Wanda looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone deciding how much to trust what they're seeing. Then she handed me her personal cell phone, stood by the door while I called, and didn't ask afterward what we'd talked about. Murray Beckett was 74 years old and had worked the next bay over from me for 19 years. We had been close the way men who work with their hands get close, not through long conversations but through proximity and reliability, through knowing that when a job went sideways, the man beside you wouldn't disappear. He answered on the second ring. I told him where the manila envelope was, back of the file cabinet in my workshop, hanging folder marked insurance. Old. Inside were the estate attorney's letters and the draft of a trust document I had asked her to prepare for my grandson Jake, 14 years old, May's favorite, the one who called me Sunday mornings just to check in, not to ask for anything, just to check. That boy had been doing that for 3 years. He deserved every cent of what was coming at his own time, on his own terms. I told Murray what I needed done. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I'll leave in 20 minutes. I said the spare key was under the lip of the workbench, left side. He said, "I know where it is." That was the end of the conversation. The other thing he needed to know about was the cameras. I had installed them 14 months earlier, after a neighbor 2 houses down had tools stolen out of his truck bed, nothing elaborate. A Ring doorbell on the front, a second camera above the garage, and a small indoor unit mounted on a shelf in the workshop, angled to cover the main bench. They fed to an app on my phone and stored footage to a cloud account for 30 days. I gave Murray the login. I want to be clear, at that point I did not know for certain what my daughter and her husband were going to do next. I had the sound of an engine running slightly wrong, but the cameras were already there, installed months before any of this started. I had put them up to protect my tools. As it turned out, that was exactly what they did. My daughter visited every other day. Her husband came twice. On his second visit, he brought up the care facility again, more directly. He showed me a brochure on his phone, A senior living community on the north side of town, he said. Nice place, very reasonable. I looked at it. I nodded slowly, the way a man in pain nods when he seems too tired to argue. He told me they had my best interests in mind. He used the word practical again. I said nothing to correct him. What I said the next morning to Wanda was, I need to see the cloud footage from my workshop camera, last 72 hours. She pulled it up on her tablet, sitting beside the bed with the screen angled from the door. We watched in silence. My daughter and her husband had been in my workshop for 40 minutes the previous afternoon. They had gone through the file cabinet, they opened it, found the hanging folders, flipped through them one by one. My son-in-law pulled out several and photographed the contents with his phone. My daughter had picked up one of May's old canning jars from the shelf, the ones May had used for 30 years to store loose hardware, and set it back down without taking it, not stealing anything yet. Assessing, taking inventory of what was available and what it might be worth. My son-in-law closed the file cabinet carefully, exactly as he'd found it. The manila envelope was not in that cabinet anymore. Murray had collected it 2 days prior. What my son-in-law had photographed was my home warranty records, my truck's maintenance history, and a folder of appliance manuals. Wanda was quiet for a moment after we stopped the video, then she said, "Are you okay?" I told her the truth, not entirely, but I will be. She looked at me steadily. "What do you need?" "Same as before," I said. "Help me get back on my feet, and don't let on that I'm moving faster than they think." She nodded once. "That I can do. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to know if you're still with me. Drop 'I'm here' in the comments right now. It helps me know you're watching, and there are more of these stories coming for you if you are." By day 12, I was walking the hallway twice daily with a walker. By day 15, once with a cane. Wanda pushed me harder than the standard protocol called for, and I let her because I had a timeline and she'd understood that without being told. Murray came to see me on day 10 with a ham sandwich and a thermos of decent coffee because he knew hospital food and had opinions about it. He sat beside the bed and told me quietly, without theater, the trust was done. The attorney had prepared it. Murray had driven to her office. I had signed everything through a mobile notary service he'd tracked down. The trust named Murray as trustee. The inheritance directed to two purposes: an educational fund for Jake, locked until his 25th birthday, and a personal account in my own name that no one could touch without my explicit written instruction. My daughter and her husband were not named in the document, not anywhere. Murray set the sandwich on the bedside table. "It cleared 2 days ago," he said. "It's done, Luther." Then he showed me his phone, another screenshot from the workshop camera, time-stamped 3 nights prior. My daughter's car in the driveway at 10:30 in the evening. 2 people going in through the side door with a key, May's old key, the one she'd given our daughter years ago. The footage showed them loading boxes into the back of their car. May's china cabinet from the dining room. My Snap-on hand tool set, the one I'd built piece by piece over 15 years, as close to irreplaceable as anything I owned. 2 portable air compressors from the workshop. A box that looked, from the dimensions, like it contained several of my power tools. My son-in-law had assessed the value correctly. He knew what those tools were worth. Murray said, 3 carloads I can account for on camera. A pause. The china cabinet was May's mother's. I sat with that for a moment. "Murray," I said, "when I get home I need you there." "I know," he said. I left the hospital on the morning of day 19. Wanda walked me to the entrance. At the door she handed off my bag and shook my hand with both of hers, the way people shake hands when the gesture is carrying more than a handshake usually carries. "Don't skip the exercises," she said. "I won't." "And Luther," she stopped, pressed her lips together for a moment. "You reminded me of my dad, the stubborn kind that gets back up." She said it professionally and quickly, the way people say something true when they've decided to say it before they can think better of it. I told her I'd be in touch. I meant it. The following week, once I was home and settled, I had the attorney prepare a letter directing $12,000 from my personal account to Murray Beckett and $10,000 to Wanda, at the address I'd asked Wanda to write down before I left. That was not an afterthought. That was the first thing I did once the money was accessible. They had each done something for me when they had no obligation to do anything. That kind of thing doesn't go unremarked. Not in my house. Murray was on the front porch when the rideshare pulled up, thermos in hand, not saying anything. He held the door. The dining room had the gap where May's cabinet had been. The garage had bare pegboard where the Snap-on set had hung for 17 years, the outlines of the tools still faintly visible in the paint. The workshop had empty spaces with shapes I knew. Each absence was specific. Each one had a weight. I stood in the dining room for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen and made coffee. My daughter arrived 40 minutes later. Her husband was with her. They came through the front door without knocking. They stopped when they saw me at the kitchen table. My daughter's face moved through several expressions at once. Surprise, then a recalibration happening in real time, the gap between what she'd prepared for and what was actually in front of her. "Dad," she said, "you're home, Dr. Kessler said at least another week." "Dr. Kessler's cautious," I said. "Sit down." They sat. Her husband put his hands flat on the table. I reached into the folder Murray had left on the counter and placed a photograph on the table, a screenshot, time-stamped, showing their car in my driveway at 10:30 at night. Neither of them spoke. I placed three more: the garage with the bare pegboard, the workshop, the dining room with the cabinet gone. The resolution was clear enough to read the license plate in the first photograph without any effort. "May's mother's cabinet," I said, "the snap-on tools, two compressors, power tools, whatever else was in those boxes." I looked at my daughter. "I need all of it back, within the week." Her husband started talking about safekeeping, about meaning to tell me, about how, given the circumstances, they had thought it made sense to. "Within the week," I said again, "or I file a report with the non-emergency line and submit the footage. It will speak for itself." Silence. My daughter looked at the photographs. Then she looked up at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, not the measured concern she usually wore, not the performance of it, something stripped of all that, something that looked, under the wreckage of everything she had planned, like the person she might have been before she started treating love as a resource to be managed. "Willis's estate," her husband said finally. His voice had flattened out. "The inheritance. The attorney." "Is finished," I said. "Probate closed. The inheritance is in trust, my personal account for my use. An educational fund for Jake, locked until he's 25, his name, no one else's." I held his gaze. "Not yours, not hers." He leaned back slowly. "You should go," I said. "Return what you took. After that, we'll see what there is to see." My daughter stood. She picked up her purse. She looked at me across that kitchen table, the way children look at parents when they realize the parent had been paying attention all along. Careful, patient, steady attention, and that everything built on the assumption otherwise has just collapsed. She didn't say she was sorry. I don't know if she was. Some things need more distance than a kitchen table allows before they can be said honestly. They left. Murray came in from the back porch, poured himself a cup, and sat down across from me without asking whether I wanted company. He had the particular gift of knowing when presence was the right answer and everything else was just noise. My grandson called that Sunday morning, same as always. He asked how I was doing, not about the house, not about Willis's estate, just how I was doing. I told him I was better than I'd been in a while. He said that was good, he'd been worried. He said his mom had told him I was in the hospital, and he'd wanted to visit, but she'd said maybe not yet. I told him maybe next weekend would work, if he wanted to come by and I'd cook something. He said he'd be there. That boy, 14 years old, calling his grandfather on Sunday mornings just to check. May had seen something in him early on that the rest of us were still catching up to. What I know now that I didn't know 2 months ago is this: dignity is not something other people give you. You have to be the one who decides it belongs to you, and you have to be willing to protect it, even when protecting it is hard, and the person threatening it is someone you raised. I spent years sending money I couldn't afford to people who had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a resource. I told myself it was love. Maybe some of it was. But somewhere along the way, I had confused love with making myself smaller so other people could feel larger. The tools came back within the week. All of them, including May's mother's cabinet, which had a small crack along one leg from being moved. I repaired it myself with wood glue and a clamp, and left it to cure for 24 hours the way the job requires. And when I removed the clamp, it held exactly the way I knew it would. If this story found its way to you today, if you recognized something in it, if you saw yourself somewhere in these 69 years of doing things the honest way and wondering why it didn't seem like enough, then I want you to hear this. It was always enough. The problem was never you. Don't wait for a broken hip in a hospital bed to understand your own worth. God has a way of returning to us what was always ours, not always in the time or manner we expected, but always in the right order once we stop getting in the way of it. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, and tell me if this one meant something to you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe if you believe quiet strength matters. There are more of these stories coming, and I'm grateful you were here for this one.